You're referring to the judges of the book prizes, not the judges of the High Court, I think. Yeah. Well, it won't happen. See, in this business, no one really wants to admit ever having made a mistake. I mean, there's that old thing from Love Story that being in love means never having to say you're sorry. And when it comes to the media, it means being a journalist, never having to say you're sorry. And so they will never apologise. They rarely apologise or concede they've got anything wrong. So I don't think no one will want to ask to have it taken back because no one wants to properly admit that it was ever given. And so the Australia Press Council just takes it down, the statement down off the website. So this is the Australian Press Council. This is a prestigious body. It presides over all the media in the country, and they gave this award to Louise Milligan, and now they've taken it off their website. And I think that's what will happen. The books will just go, it'll be like the 7:30 report, they will just disappear. The transcripts will disappear. And it's up to us and those who write books and those who sell books to make sure it doesn't disappear. But as to whether it should, yes, it should, because I can't think of anyone who got a book for non-fiction, and the book was about two matters. It was about the alleged offences that Pell committed in a public pool in Ballarat in the presence of scores of people in summer. Those offences. And it deals with the offences in St Patrick's Cathedral at greater length, which occurred in St Patrick's Cathedral on a Sunday after solemn mass with something like 350 people in the vicinity, including those attending church, those serving in the church, and busloads of Taiwanese tourists who in those days they got off the plane and there was nothing much open in Melbourne on a Sunday. So they'd whiz them down to St Patrick's Cathedral, and they had women out the back who weren't called as witnesses in the case, you know. They had women, people out the back who were trying to stop them coming into the back of the church. And so you had the presence, and there'll be other tourists too. You had about 350 people. So Louise Milligan says that Pell's offending in public places, and then this is looked at. So the allegations about the Eureka swimming pool went to a separate trial, which the ABC never reported, and they were thrown out by the same judge who presided over the Cathedral case. They were thrown out because there was no evidence to support them. So what a senior judge in Victoria, the chief judge of the county court, said in Victoria, there's no evidence to support this. So that's in Milligan's book. And then you get to the Victorian Court of Appeal about the St Patrick's Cathedral allegations, and Mark Weinberg, who at the time was the most senior judge in the criminal law jurisdiction in Australia, Weinberg rips it apart, and then it goes to 7 judges of the High Court, and they essentially agree with Weinberg, and they have their own reasons. And one of the reasons is the second charge that Pell was on in relation to the Patrick Cathedral didn't allegedly happen in the pre-sacrament after Mass, but in a crowded corridor 2 months later with an internal procession. Frank Brennan's been through the other case very well here, and it's in his book, and I would urge you to buy it. It's a very good book. So what was said is that Pell was not presiding at this occasion. He was not presiding. He was there with the priest who was conducting the Mass, who was never called by the police as a witness. In fact, the police admitted that the second charge, which went from Victoria Police through the Magistrates Court, through the District Court, through 2 judges in the majority judgment in the Victorian Court of Appeal, and into the High Court, I'm not exaggerating, was never investigated. The police didn't ask one witness. They didn't ask the priest. They didn't ask any of the 50 people who were in the procession. So the High Court says in relation to this, and it's quite amusing, I mean, it's sad for George Pell, he spent 2 years in solitary confinement effectively, but the High Court said, you know, it's quite a sight to imagine, they said in unanimous judgment, that there's the Archbishop of Melbourne in his full clerical regalia, moving from the back of the queue to the back of the procession to the middle, and sexually assaulting a boy, and then proceeding back without anyone noticing it. I mean, it couldn't happen, but it got all the way through all those systems, and propelled by Louise Milligan. But is anyone going to say that Louise Milligan got it wrong? Well, the ABC's not, Melbourne University Press is not, The Age is not, the Sydney Morning Herald is not. Doesn't leave many. Catholic Weekly might have a go. So there you go. So I think the answer is no, but that's just pretty normal. Look, I mean, I'll give an example. I don't think I've ever fully withdrawn it. Walter Duranty, who was a Soviet agent from the New York Times, won the Pulitzer Prize for reporting the Soviet Union in the 30s in Ukraine. Said what a wonderful place it was. I mean, 4.5 million people died of a forced famine. He won the Pulitzer Prize. As Malcolm Muggeridge pointed out, he was an absolute thug and a liar. But he won the Pulitzer Prize and he held it for 6 decades, and now they're sort of talking about whether they might revoke it. I mean, if you can miss the forced famine of 4.5 million people and still win the Pulitzer Prize, the chances of Milligan giving anything back are pretty remote, I would think. Yeah. I'm not saying she shouldn't. I mean, of course she should. Yeah. Well, if you ask 3 questions, I suppose I've got to give you 3 answers. Robert Richter was devastated after Pell's conviction. Robert Richter QC was the chief counsel for the defence, and he had a nervous breakdown. And this is written about in books. He just couldn't believe he'd lose that case, having got off some people in other cases who may not have deserved getting off. But I think it's a good point, and I've hinted at it in my book, and I don't believe that Robert Richter and Ruth Shan did some very good work. I don't believe that they understood the strength of anti-Catholic sectarianism in Australia. I don't think they had any idea. Now, if they'd asked me, I would have told them. And the two and others. And I remember discussing this with a QC friend of mine in Melbourne before the trial, and we thought it would be very, very grim. Because we'd both come up in the Democratic Labor Party. We knew what anti-Catholic sectarianism was like in Victoria. I'd been through it for, well, not in recent years, but when I was in Melbourne for all my life. And I don't think Ricker understood it. Now, how you react in those circumstances, I don't know. Frank Brennan thought Pell should have gone into the witness box. That's probably right. But there was such a pile-on, almost a decade pile-on from the journalist and the Royal Commission. Would any of that made any difference? But you can question that. 7-0 in the High Court was hugely important, I agree with you. I mean, 5-2, 4-3 wouldn't have done. And it was a remarkable judgment. And it was put out pretty quickly, because when you read the transcript and you watch the proceedings on video, I mean, the case... well, the point was that no one could explain, and Milligan hasn't explained, no one could have explained how the crime could have taken place. And I think other errors were made. There was an inspection of the cathedral by the jury, both juries, on a Wednesday afternoon. They should have been there on a Sunday at 11 o'clock. I mean, it'd be like saying the crime committed was at Sydney Cricket Ground on the first day of the testing. You take the crowd out there on a Tuesday afternoon in winter and say, this is the scene of the crime. So there were all those, but 7:30 I think was immensely important. The ABC, look, in fairness, Paul Fletcher, the Minister for Communications, is well aware of the ABC problems, but what do you do? The government appoints the board and the chair, and the board with the chair appoint the managing director, who's also the editor-in-chief. And like any company, it's run by its executives. It's run by the managing director and editor-in-chief. David Anderson doesn't live up to that task as editor-in-chief, but nor did Mark Scott, and nor does most of them. So unless you can get someone in there as editor-in-chief and managing director who wants to reform the place, it doesn't matter what the ABC board does, because no one takes any notice. It's a staff collective. I call it a staff Soviet. It runs itself. So Insiders runs Insiders, Q&A runs Q&A, 7:30 runs 7:30, and even when management gets involved, they often tell them to piss off. I'm serious. That's what happens. So the only thing to hope for is that there are enough people on the board who are knowledgeable enough to appoint a managing director and editor-in-chief who can do the job. And that requires someone who can stand up to the likes of Sarah Ferguson, Louise Milligan, and Tony Jones and all of that, and very few people can do it. Because you got to be tough to do it, because they're ferocious, and most people aren't tough. To handle the ABC, you really got to eat glass for breakfast. You might try it sometime. It's not too bad actually. It can be quite enjoyable, yeah. But it is a real problem. I mean, your point, Dallas, is right. It's a serious problem. You're seeing it now with the ABC, and I've written my column about it for the Australian on Saturday, and I'll probably cover it in my Media Watchdog blog, which goes up online in the Australian tomorrow. But it's just terrible. But I don't know what anyone... I mean, because John Howard, great Prime Minister, he didn't succeed. He appointed Donald MacDonald chairman. So, because chairmans don't run it. So it is a problem. It's a real problem. Yep. Well, I think you're correct. I should say I think Archbishop Fisher was courageous for the position he took. And I think that should be acknowledged. In my book, I'm very critical of Francis Sullivan and the commission that he headed. In my view, and I said this from day one, right from the start, that the line before the Royal Commission should have been, which Sullivan wouldn't do, should have been, the Catholic Church acknowledges the terrible crimes that were committed by some priests and brothers over some decades. We acknowledge that, but we also state that we were the first institution in Australia, secular or religious, who addressed the issue, with the Melbourne response in Melbourne in 1996 and towards healing in all the other dioceses and archdioceses in 1997. No one else did it. So what they should have done was, we got it wrong, we addressed it, perhaps we haven't addressed it sufficiently, but we're ahead of the others. Instead, they didn't do that. They backed off, they apologised, and they let anyone to say anything, and no one ever challenged it. The only person who had legal defence of his own was George Pell, and the others relied on what the Catholic Church gave them. Now, quite frankly, I think the Church's representation, and one of the people who did it is someone I know, was woeful, absolutely woeful. And I think Francis Sullivan's role was woeful, and the damage was done. In relation to Victoria, I think people are intimidated. I had my agreements and I had my disagreements with Bob Santamaria, and I wrote a book about him, which I think is pretty fair because it was well received by both his critics and his supporters, which is nice. But Bob's favourite film was High Noon because he saw himself as Gary Cooper. I'm not sure who was Grace Kelly, but anyway, he was Gary Cooper. And you know what, those of you who've seen the film, the baddies are coming into town, the sheriff's there, he's got a wife, but she's a pacifist and doesn't want to take any sort of action. So they're coming in to kill him, and he's got all these supporters. They're in the church, and they're in the hotel, and they're in the club, and they're in their houses, and one by one they all go. And Bob saw that, his position as a prominent Catholic in Victoria at the time of the split and stuff. I mean, he held a lot of people in Victoria, but what do you know, he looked around and suddenly all these people say, I'll support you. They're not there. So, and I think there's a lot of that. And the easy thing to do in the Pell case was to say nothing. Not to criticise Pell, but to say nothing. And to say something was pretty tough, you know. So I can understand why they did it, but I think the atmosphere in Victoria is poisonous, you know. I don't think anyone in Victoria has taken my book. I mean, individuals have. Conan does this massive mail outs, and we've sold lots of copies into Victoria. But Frank Brennan's the rector of Newman College. He's a well-known Catholic. He's a liberal Catholic, not a conservative Catholic. Frank hasn't been asked to address any function in Melbourne on his book, and he's living there. So look, I agree with you, but and that's why my Archbishop Fisher, and Archbishop Porteous down in Hobart, someone's got to have a go, you know. I'm not saying the audience here is, and I'm not talking about the audience here, but and I look back on people like Mannix and Pell, and they had a go. Now, we're all affected by the fall, original sin. We all make mistakes and all of that, but someone's got to have a go. But I can't see I'm not critical of the current Archbishop, he hasn't been there very long. I think Archbishop Little left a terrible legacy for Pell. And he was a very weak man and caused a lot of the problems. But to be fair to the Catholic Church in Victoria, in particular those who performed worse, which was Archbishop Little in Melbourne and Bishop Morcans in Ballarat, in fairness to them, as I point out in my book, Victoria Police knew about the offending of Monsignor Day and Gerald Ridsdale, both of them by 1975. Ridsdale had raped the son of a policeman. They could have had both men in jail and the rest wouldn't have happened. So we can be critical of, and I am critical of Little and Morcans, but my God, Victoria Police bears the prime responsibility for this. And the one bloke who's in my book, who reported the police, he lost his job, and he didn't get compensation until about 2 years ago. So even the current lot of police wouldn't compensate him for forcing him out of the police force. So we've got to remember Victoria Police. But I agree with you. But I mean, on the other hand, you know, it's not easy standing up, you know, unless you like fights. Yeah. In which case it's fun. Yeah. Well, I'll come back to that. I should make one other point. I mean, certainly Cardinal Pell had financial assistance, not from the church, from outside the church, to do that, and some of it came from Catholics, some of it came from non-Catholics. I know some who supported Pell who were not Catholics at all. But I should also say that there was a Christian brother who was acquitted by the Victorian Court of Appeal a year before Pell was acquitted by the High Court. And his situation, he had no money, much. And he got a 3-zip decision in the Victorian Court of Appeal, and Weinberg was the judge on that Court of Appeal, plus 2 other judges. And the circumstances to Pell's conviction were almost identical. There was an allegation made 40 years after the event. Some of the witnesses who could have supported the person who was charged were dead. There was absolutely no evidence, and the complainant had made allegations about events that happened at certain places where the brother could not have been because he wasn't even in the school. It was a school at Geelong. I mean, this was absolutely outrageous, but that got through a jury, but it was thrown out where Pell's case should have been thrown out in the Victorian Court of Appeal. So he had no money. He's still alive. He's a very sick man. He spent a year and a half in solitary confinement. I've spoken to some of his friends, a very decent bloke, completely ruined, won't come out of his room much at the area where he's living. I forget his name for the moment, but he's in the book. So it wasn't just money. This bloke had no money, but he got through the Victorian Court of Appeal. But again, this went through Victoria Police, it went through the Magistrates Court, he was convicted in the County Court, he was acquitted in the Court of Appeal. Pell had that, except he went down by a majority judgment. The Court of Appeal went to the High Court. Now, in relation to Victoria Police, well, Victoria Police has got a long, scandalous history in Victoria. I remember from the time when I was down there, I've always been interested in crime, and I used to follow the detectives and their arrests and stuff, and still one by one, when I was a pretty young lad, and they started disappearing, they sort of headed off to Pentridge Prison because quite a few of the homicide guys went into jail in Pentridge for corruption and accepting bribery and stuff. But Commissioner Ashton's behaviour was untruthful. He was interviewed after the case by Neil Mitchell on 3AW, it's in the book, and it was put to him that Victoria Police had set up an inquiry into Pell before any complaints had been made. And on live radio, he denied that. I mean, it came out in evidence. They set up Operation Tethering a year before they got any complaints. And the first I'm not joking. The first complaint they got on a Tuesday morning was a man who'd been released from a psychiatric prison on the Monday afternoon. And then eventually this case. They advertised for witnesses against Pell who were choristers at the solemn mass. None came forward. They flew to Rome. Pell demolished their case. I've read his evidence. Oh, his evidence is available. It was put up on YouTube again. Victoria Police took theirs down. But Pell's evidence about the Cathedral case was a public document, and Pell just ripped it to shreds and told them to go back and do some work. They didn't do it. They didn't interview people. But over there were 3 policemen, including the current, Patton, who took over from Ashton as the current Chief Commissioner in Victoria. He was there. I mean, this was a disgraceful investigation. But what happened to Payton? Well, after Ashton stood down, the Andrews government of Victoria promoted Patton to Chief Commissioner with a 5-year term. So, but I think the good news is from that brother down in Geelong is that, you don't need a lot of money. He would have had some, but he may have had legal aid, I don't know. But on the Court of Appeal, he had 3 sensible judges. And the point that Weinberg made in the Court of Appeal was very interesting. He said, and he was, I think, effectively warning his fellow judges. He said, juries invariably get it right, almost always get it right. He said, but the words are almost always. And then he said there's one difference between a jury decision and a judge's decision. He said, jurors don't give reasons, judges had to. And Pell's case fell apart once people started reading the reasons for judgment. In the Victorian Court of Appeal, it was an absolutely shoddy judgment and it fell apart. And in the High Court, the presentation was that. And it's a rare thing indeed that all 7 judges, 2 of them based in Melbourne, did a unanimous jury against the 2 most senior judges in Victoria. Jeff Kennett said, the former Victorian Premier, said that both should have resigned. In that situation, I would have. No, Monica, I never make predictions, but I think it's an increasing problem, and we've got. I've read about that case, but I think that's best left to judges. But the current case that hasn't come up is this case down in Canberra, where allegation of rape in Parliament House. There's been a huge amount of public comment on it. Now, in all these cases, people may be guilty or people may be innocent, but how anyone gets a fair trial with the current media parlance, I don't know. And there's another issue here as well, that is how do you stop jurors going on social media? I mean, jurors are told when you go home. Days gone by for large parts of the end of trials, they lock jurors up. They don't do that anymore. So they're told when you go home, you can't discuss it with anyone and don't go on social media. But how does anyone know that that's going to happen? I mean, you can go on social media and find out anything. And of course, you have to accept that people haven't done it. But I mean, you can't accept that. So I'd be interested to see how this case goes and the other case goes. But I don't know enough about the facts in individual cases as to what a judge... As a general rule, the High Court has said, as I recall, the High Court has said that trial should proceed. So the general position in the past has been you can have a stay of trial, but not a permanent stay. And I don't know what's going to happen in that case, but I don't think the publicity in that case is anything like the publicity in the Pell case. And Pell didn't apply for a stay, and... he didn't apply for one, so he didn't get one, but it wouldn't have mattered because all the stuff was around. If he'd gone on trial 3 years later, it was all around. And I should say, Monica, you've been a great reporter of this, and it was worth it, and a good speaker at the Sydney Institute too. No, I haven't said that journalists can't be trusted, and I haven't said that jurors can't be trusted.
You said that journalists were fallible.
Well, of course, we're all fallible, aren't we? I mean, to journalists, some journalists were quite good on the Pell case. I mean, there were a number of journalists who Monica DeMitt was one of them, and there are others. And I think, it's in my book, John Sylvester disliked Pell intensely. He said from day one that this never should have gone to trial. No, I haven't said that, but what I have said is that it's not a question of whether you trust people, whether you don't trust people. It's a question of whether anyone can get whether unconscious bias exist everywhere else except in the legal system. So maybe there's more of a case of trial by judge alone, but that's not available in Victoria. They made some exceptions during the pandemic, but it's not available. Now, even if Pell had got a judge like Anne Ferguson, the Chief Justice, or Chris Maxwell, the President of the Court of Appeal, as a sole judge, at least the judge would have had to written given reasons which could have been contested. So I'm not saying that. And I agree with I agree with Justice Weinberger that juries almost always get it right. That's what I said earlier. But as Weinberg said, the issue is the words are almost always, and sometimes they get it wrong. And then, as Frank Brennan has pointed out, the duty falls on the Court of Appeal. And I point out in my book that the judge in the county court went on the project, of all places, after Pell's conviction, and effectively said, well, look, these matters aren't up to me. If there's something wrong with the jury verdict, it's up to the Court of Appeal. When it went to the Court of Appeal, it went down 2-1. Had it gone the other way, that matter would have been resolved. Pell would have spent 5 months in jail instead of nearly 2 years. He would have spent 8 months. I think he got an extra 8 months or something out of that. No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, and some journalists are right, but all I'm saying about journalists is they should be challenged. I mean, if someone writes to me and said, where does that quote come from? I write back and say, well, here it is. I don't run to my publisher and say, tell them to stop asking me questions, which was the Milligan case. If someone comes to me and says, like David Marr has done and said that, hinted that, or claimed that I hadn't said what I haven't said, I said, well, you know, I'd point out what I have said. So all I'm calling for is proper standards, and a lot of journalists have done very well. But there were a number of obsessive journalists who took up the Pell case. And I focus on David Marr, Louise Milligan, Lucy Morris-Marr, and the Guardian journalist Melissa Davey. They're the ones I focus on. And what I've done in this book, I've listed over 100 names of journalists, commentators, lawyers, and others who I have criticised in this book. There are over 100. And it's now out nearly 4 months, and not one person has come to me and said that anything I said about them or the book is wrong. Not one. I haven't heard from anyone. Everyone's just gone quiet. I'd be quite happy to hear from people. Could I be happy to debate the issue? But the Age won't, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Age and the ABC won't discuss my book, Frank Brennan's book, or Keith Windschuttle's book. And I regard that as an act of gross intellectual cowardice.